Mental illness and mankind's attempt to treat it went through innumerable changes over the millennia, from the shamanic rituals of the Stone Age to the exorcists, and then on to the animal magnetists of the 18th century. In the 19th century, the treatment of mental illness became a much more scientific process as many medical professionals put their scientific training to use in attempting to explain and treat mental disease. The main features of this early psychiatry included the use of hypnotism to treat many mental illnesses. The illnesses that were most studied at the time were spontaneous somnambulism, lethargy, catalepsy, multiple personality, and hysteria. The use of hypnotism to treat these illnesses led to the development of a new model of the human mind, separating the conscious and the unconscious. This in turn led to the new theories on how mental illness developed, such as pathological mental energy stemming from the unconscious mind. These illnesses were treated with not only hypnotism, but an emphasis on building rapport with the patient was established, which paved the way for more modern psychotherapy. The earliest form of hypnotism, animal magnetism, was found by Franz Mesmer, who believed that the hypnotic state caused by magnetizing someone was due to a mysterious, invisible, magnetic fluid that surrounded everything. Later, this magnetized state was referred to as artificial somnambulism, or in other words, the magnetizer put the patient into a sleepwalking-like state. Mesmer's disciple, the Marquis de Puysegur, led the magnetism movement away from the magnetic fluid theory and focused more on the psychological processes that were happening in these somnambulic states. Much later, under the name of hypnotism, extensive studies were done by medical professionals at the Nancy and Salpêtrière schools, where men like Pierre Janet realized that the rapport of the hypnotizer and patient was much more important than the technique of hypnotism itself. The systematic study of the hypnotic state led to the discovery of parts of the mind that had never been studied, as they were not part of normal consciousness. The French physician Joseph Récamier was even able to use the hypnotic state in lieu of anesthesia and perform pain-free surgery on his patients. Many other ailments were cured using hypnotic suggestion. One of the most controversial issues of hypnotism was the practice of age regression. Hypnotists were able to bring their patients back to their childhood while in hypnotic states. Their voices and mannerisms would even change to be more childlike as they communicated with the hypnotist while hypnotized. One famous account by the hypnotist, the Colonel de Rochas, took age regression to the extreme. He would guide his patients back into time until they were an infant. Then he would bring them back even further, which caused a blackout period. After going back even further past this blackout period, the patient would start to recall foreign memories, and many people believe that these were memories from a previous life, thus proving reincarnation. However, many people started to doubt de Rochas as his claims began to become more absurd, claiming that he could guide his patients forward in time so that they could visit their next life. These type of mystical claims caused many professionals to doubt hypnotism, along with the negative aspects of hypnotism such as practitioners taking advantage of hypnotized patients, inexperienced hypnotists not being able to wake people up, or suggesting that they do foolish things while under hypnosis. There were also reports of people who were exposed to hypnotism for too long and would gradually become addicted to it. Although hypnotism was the standard of treatment at psychiatric hospitals for much of the 19th century, these shortcomings led to the development of new techniques to explore the unconscious mind without hypnotism. One condition that became of great interest was something called ambulatory automatism, or in other words, a fugue state. While in a fugue state, the individual would seem to be awake and go about their day in a relatively normal fashion, but then would suddenly awake from this altered state and have no recollection of what had happened, almost as if they had been hypnotized. In some cases, these fugue states could last years, in which the individual would live as if they were a completely different person, and then one day snap back into their original personality, completely forgetting their other life. These case studies led to the development of multiple personality disorder. This discovery led psychiatrists to view the countless cases of demonic possession reported throughout history in a new light, for many aspects of possession are similar to multiple personality disorder. There are reports of people who had personalities that spoke a different language than them, and in one famous case, a young woman had an alternate personality that was blind and deaf, and whenever that personality took over, she would go long periods of having really lost her vision and hearing. Eventually, the interest shifted from multiple personality disorder to hysteria. The treatment developed to treat hysteria at the end of the 19th century finally started to bridge the gap between hypnosis and more modern-day psychiatry. Throughout the ages, hysteria was thought to affect only women and that the disorder originated in the uterus. However, in 1859, the French physician Paul Briquet did the first truly scientific study on hysteria and found that 1 in 20 cases affected men, and so hysteria became considered a neurosis of the brain. Briquet also denied the common misconception that hysteria was caused by sexual frustration, for there were virtually no reported cases of hysteria of celibate nuns, but many cases among the prostitutes of Paris. There were many similarities between the symptoms of hysteria and the effects of hypnotism, which led to an extensive study, and many hysterical patients were cured with hypnotism. As the leading physicians studied hysteria, their terminology gradually changed from outdated terms like artificial somnambulism to modern-day terminology like dual personality, which paved the way for the new systems of psychiatry that would rise up to replace hypnotism. Another advancement came with the way psychiatrists began to view the human mind, and two schools of thought rose up. The first of which viewed the human mind in two parts, the everyday conscious mind and the underconscious or unconscious mind that is partially accessible in dreams and hypnotic states. The other view was that the human mind consisted of numerous sub-personalities that operated under one chief personality known as the ego. These new views helped psychiatrists come to the conclusion that many complexes and diseases could originate in the mind itself, as the conscious mind transferred highly emotional experiences into the unconscious, which then manifested as all sorts of symptoms, working in a similar manner as hypnotic suggestion. Although some forms of traditional psychotherapy were practiced all throughout the 19th century, for most of the 1800s, there was an emphasis on using hypnotism to cure mental illness. However, as the systematic study of hypnotism advanced, more and more emphasis was being put on the rapport between the physician and the patient. The relationship between patient and hypnotist was a very intimate one, and the patient must believe in the hypnotist's ability if the hypnosis was to be successful. Towards the end of the 19th century, many physicians started to lose interest in hypnotism, for there were some major drawbacks to the technique. The biggest being, not everyone is capable of being hypnotized, and in some instances, patients would just fake it. Another major problem was that as the hypnotist and patient built rapport, the patient would start to infer what the hypnotist was trying to do. While hypnotized, the patient would act accordingly, not because the treatment was working, but rather the hypnotist was unknowingly suggesting to the patient to act as if they were cured, instead of actually curing them. By the year 1900, hypnotism was basically obsolete, and newer systems of psychiatry were established. These new systems found their foundations on the work of men like Emil Kraepelin, whose life's work resulted in the classification of many mental illnesses, including dementia praecox, later to be termed as schizophrenia by Eugene Buehler, and manic depressive illness. Buehler eventually became the head of the Bergenzoli Mental Hospital, where Carl Jung began his career under his direction. It was there that while studying the schizophrenic patients, the psychiatrist started to drift away from hypnosis and started to probe the unconscious mind with new techniques, such as Jung's word association test and eventually Freud's psychoanalytic concepts. Around the same time, Pierre Janet developed his theory on psychotherapy, a version of hysteria that primarily affected men. His theory involved a concept of psychological tension. This mental energy in the wrong proportion could cause mental illnesses, a concept that Buehler applied to his growing theory on schizophrenia. Around this time period, the term dynamic psychiatry became popular due to the ever-evolving nature of psychiatry. As the Victorian era came to an end, there was a growing interest in the psychology and pathology regarding human sexuality. There was also a growing interest in the feminine psyche as the feminist movement began and women started to gain more rights. The study of sexuality even involved how it manifested in children, paving the way for Freud's later work. And by 1886, the Austrian clinician Richard von Krafft-Ebing published his Psychopathia Sexualis, an extensive collection of case studies of individuals with abnormal sexuality. Krafft-Ebing distinguished 4 classes of sexual abnormality, the first being the absence of sexual drive. The second was a pathological increase of the sex drive. The third was an abnormal period of emergence of the sex drive, either too early or too late. And lastly were perversions, which included sadism, necrophilia, masochism, fetishism, and exhibitionism, along with another subcategory containing pathological sexualized objects such as pedophilia, zoophilia, gerontophilia, which is sexual attraction to the elderly. Another area of interest was the study of dreams. Some of the earliest objective studies on dreams came from Gotthilf Heinrich von Schubert, who proposed that dreams represented psychic processes in a symbolic language, and that these symbols could be interpreted, a view that Freud later expanded on in his famous book, The Interpretation of Dreams. A result of the extensive study of dreams by these early pioneers led to a solidified concept of the unconscious, a concept that was extremely popular by the end of the 19th century. Philosophically speaking, almost everyone agreed that there was an unconscious part of the mind, but psychologists of that time were seeking to prove it scientifically, a goal which much progress was made in the last decade of the 19th century. Some of the earliest experiments conducted regarding the unconscious dealt with measuring how intense a stimulus needed to be for someone to consciously perceive it, and whether or not the stimuluses that happened below the threshold of perception were absorbed by the unconscious mind. Hermann von Helmholtz discovered the concept of unconscious inference, which states that we unconsciously attribute meaning to anything we experience based off of our past experience. This process happens automatically without the conscious part of the mind playing an active role. Meanwhile, Carl Jung started to use his technique of word association to probe the unconscious mind without hypnotism. The relationship between the conscious and the unconscious was studied extensively, and 3 types of relationships were designated. The first was the normal relationship, where the conscious and unconscious mind were in harmony, and the unconscious's influence was subtle and remained mostly unnoticed. The second was a pathological separation between the two, where the unconscious took on its own characteristics outside of the relationship with the conscious and became a second personality, which could then intermittently take control of the whole mind, like in multiple personality disorder or in the temporary fits a neurotic hysterical patient has. Or thirdly, when the conscious and unconscious mind were in open rebellion with each other, resulting in uncontrollable impulses, phobias, and obsessions. In severe cases, the conscious mind could be completely consumed by the unconscious and result in insanity. Theodore Flournoy came up with a concept called cryptomnesia, which referred to the forgotten memories that were stored in the unconscious mind that affected conscious behavior, a term that was later absorbed by Freud's concept of repression. Many others believed that when conscious patterns were repeated enough, the unconscious would make these patterns automatic by forming habits. In this same manner, certain aspects of the personality could be stored in the unconscious and be released automatically when triggered by a certain situation. Many also believe that humankind's creativity came from the unconscious. With the turn of the 20th century, many great men rose up and completely changed the way we looked at the human mind. But much of their work relied on many of the discoveries previously mentioned. In our next video in this series, we will begin to take an in-depth look at some of these men that still influence the way we see the world today over 100 years later.